So we're going to keep working on this process we were doing before. It looks different because I've played around a bit in the interim before I've come back to here. But essentially, if we go in here, we can see that if we open the attribute table, we can see we've got all that same information. Now, one of the things that's important is, that has all that information. But for us to work out population density, what we really need to understand is to understand how we really work out population density, which is really actually it's the number of people divided by the land area. So we've got that information in this table. We go back to what we can see that we've got on the attribute table. We've got over here we've got that field total population PP there, and then we've got at the end there we've got the area. So let's use that. So one way to start by doing this is to actually duplicate that little package. So I'm going to actually duplicate that layer here. So I've now got another version of it. So I'm going to turn off the original one, and I'm going to put this one here, and I'm going to rename that layer. I'm going to rename it population density. ACT. And so if we go back to that table, I'm going to show you how to use the table now to manipulate it. And so if we go back to the table, we can see here we've got all of those fields. We really don't need them all. So if we press this button up here, which is this edit button, we can then start to edit things. Going across the top and hesitating above these things, we can see that there's a whole lot of things we can do. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete all the fields that we don't necessarily need. And so if we press on that delete field button, a little pop-up comes up like this. And so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to select everything, and then I'm going to hold the command key down, or the Apple key, and I'm going to deselect the ones I want, which is I want to keep the ID, the code, and the name. And that's because if we keep them in all of them, then we have a way to correlate the data. Total PP, top PP is everybody, which we need. And if I go to the bottom, I'm also going to do area albas, square kilometers. So what I've done there is if you can imagine, I've selected all of those, select all, Control A or Command A or whatever. And then I've gone and I've deselected by using the Command key, just the ones I want. So if I press OK, it'll ask me, and it'll then, well, it didn't even ask me then, it'll process it, and it'll give me a much more simplified table at this point. It has to have a think about it. So as you can see, now we've just got this identifying data on the left here, total population, and the area. Now, what we can do is we're now going to add a new field that we're actually going to calculate something from. And so if I go up here, you'll see if I go to new field, I'm actually going to call that field, pop density. Now you see down here, it talks about numbers. Now we talked before about numbers, but integers are whole numbers. But we actually want decimal numbers because we're dividing an area by a decimal figure. And so we want the answer to be decimal. We click on that, we press OK, and you see there is the column. And the column really doesn't have anything in it because we haven't done a calculation, which is what we're about to do now. So it's best not to be frightened. And so I'm going to open the field calculator here. And when I open the field calculator, there are a number of options. Create a new field. So I could have actually created the field there and then, but I've already created it. So I'm going to print update a field, and I'm going to choose that I want to update this field population density. Now this is math stuff, but it doesn't actually have to be that because there's a whole lot of guiding things down here. Now, if we look along here, what we can see in here is fields and variables. Now, if we remember from population density, and don't forget, you can just type in to Google how you calculate population density and you'll get this. If I get fields, we know that population density is number of people per land area. So I have a field there which is total population. And if I double click on that, it pops in there. Down the bottom in here is a division symbol. I press the division side. And then what we need is the one that was the area one, and I double click on that and we get it. Now, when it says preview, that's telling us, obviously we've got a lot of decimal points there, and when we later on we could choose to play with that, but let's keep it simple for now. You know, if we then, if we include that, now we can see it's running, because you see for Acton, it's telling me that it's making its way through that field, Ainslie, etc. You know, all of the various areas that we're talking about, what their population density per square kilometre. I press OK, and there in that column there is population density. And so we've now really worked out that population density. And so you don't really see that, right? So I press this button here to turn off the calculate. And if I, so that turn off the edit. So it's, you know, it says, do you want to save that to this layer? Yes, I do. Save. And that's now there. It's obviously going to think for a second. I close it down. It's there. Nothing's really changed, right? But if I now click on that, I mean, I can go over here now, and this is where I'm going to introduce you to symbology, and I'll talk more about it, but I just want to introduce you to it. And so with symbology, basically, you'll see at the top here, it's how it renders the information. So if I go down to graduated, and I want graduated will really give me a sort of like a picture of density. So I click on graduated, it says layer styling. So let's just be clear, we're up here, population density. You know, categorized is really if we have a string, like say we have, you know, a town planning code. We've got 20 codes, we want to use them. Because we've got numbers here, we're going to use graduated. Now we don't see anything, but let's look why. So when it says value here, we choose our field, which in our field, the one we want is population density. Now you'll see that the other ones here about name, they're not shown because they're strings, but we want that one for population density. Now, again, there's a whole lot of ranges, and so we can play with that later, but for the instance, I'm just going to show you. When it says color ramp, what that means is it's got a whole lot of models where it's going to give one end of that ramp to one number in the population density field and another one to the other. So I'm now going to use, I'm going to use one where, you know, what seems to be, if we, you know, I'm just going to choose one here and imagine that if we go from a sort of maybe a, you know, we could choose red seems really bad, whereas we love density, right, if we're urban design people. So then we're going to go to red to green, right? So we go there. There's a button here that says classify. And if I press classify, you'll see now that it's showing me this range of thresholds here. And so we could change those range of classes. So if I go to, say I go to, you'll see as I change the range of classes, the numbers change because it's giving me different levels of density within that same picture, right? But we know that large parts of that landscape are actually not necessarily operating like that. So if we, because we can tell by the census fields, right? So if we kind of play around in this zone, you know, we're getting some picture. Now we can be more careful about that. But so what's interesting about that is that's giving us a visual representation where the darkest green is actually the most dense. But it's quite a, you know, if we're looking at where all the numbers are, we can look at other ways to play with that. And if we play with, for instance, you know, if we choose to look at a histogram, it will actually we press load values, it's going to show us how much is actually in here, right? And so that's where we could also move that density equation down to here if we wanted to, and we could really start to sort of pick up some information, because it means that, you know, there is a most dense area, and then it's telling us how many of those areas we are now. We've got an outlier at 5,000 here. But, you know, we can really start to play around with that to get a better picture of what that's working on the basis of, you know. And so we could also say that down this end, we've got not many people down there. So you can also do things like, actually play with those things as you see fit to kind of get a better picture of it. Like we've got a lot of graduations there. We could choose to kind of create a threshold where we sort of, we move the orange into here to give us, as I say, a finer grain picture there about how those divisions work, because otherwise we're not really getting a sort of strong picture related to the data, right? So I'm sort of playing around here to sort of try to pick up where the sort of categorizations. Now I can choose to have, if I go back to classes, I could choose to add more classes. So you can see how, how we're doing that. Now, if we ever want to kind of sort of query it, we can click on this identify features button and zoom in, and we can then say, well, what is that? That's Lynham. We can see down here because the identity results, we can see that that's Lynham down here, and we can see what it is. When I press apply, and then that's there. And so this is where we can also say, well, that's Civic. Let's look at the density of it. It's 3,000 per square meter. We can see that this is the lake. It doesn't have many people. Over here, we can see that that's forest. So you kind of get the idea, and we can choose our symbology as we see fit to try to show it. So in this thing, I've just tried to say, here's how you get that data and worked with it. Obviously, we've still got the original data here. And so we can also choose to, have kept a copy of that. Now, when we like this, we can save that layer if we want to, because we can say when it says, it's sort of, we can actually export that to create a new layer definition file if we want to for that whole section. And so that's how we can use a calculation within the table to really show us the power of how that works.